In this video, we're going to cover how we can use the rules of game theory to try to figure out what an equilibrium outcome. Remember, an equilibrium is when you don't have any incentive to change your behavior. What will the equilibrium outcome be in situations where you have strategic behavior? And we're going to motivate this with the game that's used in probably every economics class that has been taught since this idea came up. And that is something called the prisoner's dilemma. And if you have ever seen an episode of the television show Law and Order, you will recognize this very quickly. Because every episode of Law and Order is basically an entire episode where the prisoner's dilemma plays out. So here's a situation. You've got two people who have been picked up for a crime. Let's call them Bonnie and Clyde, because why not? Bonnie and Clyde are suspected of having robbed a bank, but the police do not have enough evidence to arrest them for that. But they've been picked up on a smaller weapons charge. Let's say they both were illegally in possession of weapons as a felon, right? So this lesser charge can earn them 2 years in prison. Right? So they're both facing 2 years in prison for the smaller violation. Now, if they go to jail on the bank robbery charge, what they're suspected of, they would get 20 years in prison. So they're both arrested. They're taken to separate rooms so they can't collaborate. They can't collude at all. And the DA wants to cut them a deal. They offer them a deal because they don't have enough evidence to arrest them and send them to prison for the bank robbery, but the DA sure would like to. So the DA says to each of them, if you turn state's evidence, you will go home on probation. So if you confess, you're going home. But if the other guy confesses and you don't, you are going to prison. So those are your alternatives. You confess, and the other guy doesn't, then you go home, you get probation. But if the other guy confesses first, you're doing the full ride. Now, it turns out that if they both confess at the same time, we have a judge who will be lenient and recognize that they at least are admitting the error of their ways, and they would each get 8 years in prison. So let's come up with a table that describes each of these possible outcomes and think about what they would be thinking about, right? They're each in two different rooms. What are they thinking to themselves about what they should do? So we're going to keep track of this in something called a game matrix. A game matrix is just a box divided into 4 quadrants. We've got player 1 on one side, and each of these rows represent this player, so that's player 1. The rows represent player 1's 2 strategies. She can confess or stay silent. Our player 2 is Clyde, and each of these columns, Clyde, represents his 2 strategies. He can confess, or he can stay silent. So in this case, they both happen to have the same strategies. That's not always going to be the case, but these are their 2 strategies. Now, what we put inside of these boxes are the payoffs. So payoffs go inside these boxes. So those payoffs are what the outcomes would be in each of these 4 situations. So in that situation, right, Bonnie confesses and Clyde confesses. Well, those two outcomes are if they both confess. Remember, if they both confessed, they each got 8 years in prison. We're going to make those negative because we're assuming prison's a bad thing that they do not want. So we don't want it to be a positive outcome. In this situation, that's where Bonnie is confessing, but Clyde is staying silent. So in that case, if Bonnie confesses, she's the one that goes home. She gets no years in prison. But Clyde gets the whole 20 years. In this third outcome, this is where Bonnie is staying silent and Clyde is confessing. So Clyde, we'll write this down here, Clyde is going home and Bonnie is going away for 20 years. And if you notice, in each of these boxes, the payoffs are always the same. The first one is player 1, the second one is player 2. First one is player 1, second one is player 2. First one is player 1, second one is player 2. So let's finish it up. Last box here. If they both stay silent, remember they're just going away on those weapons charges. So that's player 1's payoff. That's player 2's payoff. Now, when you write out these game matrices, it's not worth trying to save some time by not doing these P1, P2s. It'll be a lot easier to keep track of what's going on if you just take the time to write it out so you don't forget. Okay, now, if you've ever seen an episode of Law & Order, when two people are arrested at the same time, they always yell at each other the same thing. Don't talk, right? And the reason they do that is this turns out, so this outcome here, this is the best possible outcome. If we look at the total amount of prison time in each of these boxes, right? 20 years in prison, 16 years in prison, 20 years in prison, and 4 years in prison. 4 years in prison sounds the best, right? So this represents their monopoly outcome, or the cartel outcome. But if you've ever seen an episode of Law & Order, you also know that eventually somebody talks, right? This cartel outcome is rare, and the reason why it's rare is once you get the other person to commit to that strategy, your best response is not to commit to that strategy. So let's walk through how this works. Now, I'm going to use a little trick that I would recommend you doing on your own when you're working through problems like this. And that trick is to cover up the other strategy of what's going on. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So right now I've sort of covered up here, so we can pretend it's not there, the strategy of stay silent by Bonnie. And what we're doing by doing that is saying, let's ignore that strategy exists right now. So we're going to start with Clyde. What if he knows? What if he knew without a shadow of a doubt that Bonnie was going to confess? What is Clyde's best response? So Clyde's best response to Bonnie choosing the strategy confess. What should he do? Well, let's look at the outcomes, and we're going to underline the payoff to his best response as a way of keeping track of them. So he's got the option. He can if he knows she's going to confess, he can go to jail for 8 years or 20 years. Well, 8 years sounds a whole lot better than 20 years. So Clyde's best response to Bonnie choosing confess is to also confess. His best response is to also confess. Now, what if he knew without a shadow of a doubt that Bonnie was going to stay silent? So what is Clyde's best response to Bonnie choosing stay silent? Let's take a look. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to underline the payoff he gets to choosing his best response. So if she stays silent, he can go to jail for 0 years or -2. Well, going home sounds a lot better than prison, so that's what he would choose. So Clyde's best response to Bonnie staying silent is to confess. So it turns out that Clyde has something called a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy means you always choose the same thing regardless of what the other person chooses. So Clyde should just confess, right? He's going to confess. He knows he's going to confess. Bonnie doesn't know that, though. Clyde's figured out that he's going to confess no matter what. Well, now let's try to figure out what Bonnie should do. So Bonnie's covered up confess here. We've covered up Clyde's strategy of confess here, because in this case we're going to say, well, what should Bonnie do? What should Bonnie do if she knows that Clyde is going to stay silent? Remember, her payoffs are the first one in each of these columns. So what we're going to do is the same thing. We're going to underline the payoff that makes her the best off. So if she knows that Clyde is going to stay silent, she can go to jail for 0 years, she can go home, or she can go to jail for 2. She says, well, going home sounds a whole lot better. So Bonnie's best response to Clyde choosing confess is to confess herself. Okay, well, what should she do if she thinks that Clyde is going to, so before, Bonnie's best response to Clyde staying silent was to confess. What if she thinks he's going to confess? If Clyde's going to confess, if she confesses, she goes to jail for 8 years. She stays silent, she goes to jail for 20 years. That 8 years sounds a whole lot better. So now we have something called a Nash equilibrium. And it's called a Nash equilibrium after the guy who created it, the late John Nash, who was a game theorist, a Nobel Prize winning game theorist, who came up with this idea of a Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is when every player is playing their best response to the other player's best response. So a best response to a best response is a Nash equilibrium. Now it's getting maybe a little deep in the weeds for the purposes of this course, but what you need to know is that it is an equilibrium. There's no incentive to change. The way you can think about a Nash equilibrium is that there's no regrets. Nobody here goes, oh man, I really should have stayed silent, right? Because if you know that the other guy's going to confess and you stay silent, you're going to jail for a long time. And if we use this method of covering up each side and working through what is the payoff, if I choose the best payoff and working through the process like we did, when we end up with all of the payoffs underlined in a box, that is a Nash equilibrium. So keep that in mind as you're watching the videos that are after this, and we will see you in the next module.